The ballroom on the 62nd floor of the Ashcombe Tower had never sounded so loud. 500 of the wealthiest people in New York were gathered under crystal chandeliers for the autumn charity gala, and when the master of ceremonies announced the evening's icebreaker game, a wave of nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Names would be drawn at random and paired off for a short conversation exercise. A harmless bit of fun meant to loosen tongues before the auction began. Nobody expected the drawing to become the most talked-about moment on Wall Street. Waiters moved between the tables with trays of champagne, nobody was drinking quickly enough, and somewhere near the string quartet, a photographer adjusted his lens toward the stage, sensing that whatever happened next would be worth capturing. The gala existed to raise money for a children's hospital wing. But everyone in the room understood that the real entertainment of the evening had always been each other. The small dramas of who stood beside whom, who had been snubbed, who had risen, and who had fallen since the previous year's event. The host reached into the glass bowl a second time, and the room went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when everyone senses something delicious is about to happen. She read the name aloud, Celeste Van Doren. A collective breath was drawn in. Celeste ran Van Doren Capital, a private equity empire worth more than $11 billion, and she was known across every trading floor in Manhattan by a single nickname, the Ice Queen. Executives who crossed her rarely kept their jobs. Reporters who profiled her rarely got a second interview. She did not attend galas to make friends. She attended them because absence would have been noticed more than presence. She had arrived that evening in a black dress with no jewelry beyond a single silver watch, an outfit chosen precisely because it announced nothing about her and required nothing from anyone else. She had spent the first half hour of the gala fielding careful, nervous small talk from men twice her net worth's admirer count but half her actual influence, men who complimented her portfolio the way other men complimented a woman's eyes, hoping flattery about her balance sheet might somehow open a door that had never once opened for anyone in this room. The host drew the second name and read it with visible relief, as though grateful the universe had spared her the job of picking someone by hand. Damon Ashford. A murmur of amusement spread through the tables. Damon was known too, though for gentler reasons. Once a celebrated architect whose glass towers had reshaped 3 skylines, he now ran a modest restructuring consultancy that quietly saved struggling companies from collapse. He was 39, calm in a way that made other men in the room look anxious by comparison, and famously uninterested in showing off anything he owned. He had come to the gala alone, as he always did, wearing a suit that fit him well without announcing its tailor, and he had spent most of the evening near the terrace doors talking with an elderly widow about the hospital wing the gala was funding, genuinely interested in a conversation that most guests in the room would have considered beneath their attention. When his name was called, he did not react the way most men in his position might have, with a flicker of nerves or a forced smile, meant to reassure the crowd he was in on the joke. He simply set down his glass, thanked the widow for the conversation, and walked toward the stage. Someone at a nearby table laughed loud enough to be heard 3 tables over. A hedge fund manager offered his neighbor a wager, 30 seconds before she walks away, he said, and several people around him pulled out their phones to time it. The pairing felt like a punchline delivered by fate itself. The terrifying tycoon and the quiet single father everyone assumed would wilt the moment she looked at him. Nobody in that ballroom believed the two of them would exchange more than a handshake. Celeste walked toward the small round table set aside for paired conversations with the unhurried gait of a woman who had never once worried about being watched. Her expression gave away nothing, not irritation, not curiosity, nothing at all. Damon rose from his seat as she approached, pulled out her chair without being asked, and waited until she was seated before taking his own. It was such a small gesture that half the room missed it. But the half that saw it stopped laughing. He looked at her directly, the way almost nobody looked at Celeste Van Doren anymore, without flinching and without flattery. "Perhaps everyone has misjudged both of us," he said. The words were quiet, almost conversational, but they landed like a dropped glass in a silent kitchen. Celeste's eyes narrowed for half a second, not with anger but with something closer to recalibration, as if she were recounting a column of numbers that had just refused to add up the way she expected. The wagering hedge fund manager forgot to start his timer. The ballroom, for the first time all evening, was completely still. Celeste studied the man across the table the way she studied balance sheets, searching for the angle, the hidden liability, the thing men usually tried to hide from her until it was too late. She found nothing. His hands were folded loosely on the white tablecloth, his shoulders relaxed, his attention entirely on her rather than on the room full of people who might be watching him talk to her. She had spent 19 years training herself to read weakness in a stranger's posture within 3 seconds, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the reading came back empty. Damon simply held her gaze, unbothered by the silence, unbothered by the 500 eyes that had turned toward their table the moment the microphone caught her stillness. "You are the first person who did not tremble when I shook his hand," she said finally. It was not a compliment. Not exactly. More an observation delivered with the flat precision she used when closing a deal. Damon simply nodded, as though she had told him something true about the weather, rather than something true about the peculiar loneliness of being feared by everyone who met her. The MC, sensing the exercise had run its course, moved the microphone toward the next pair. But neither Celeste nor Damon looked away from each other long enough to notice. The first structured challenge of the evening required each pair to speak privately for 20 minutes at a smaller table near the terrace doors, away from the noise of the main room. Celeste treated it like a negotiation from the opening second, firing questions designed to catch a man off guard. Questions about his firm's margins, his largest client, the real reason he had walked away from architecture at the height of his fame. Damon answered each one honestly and without embellishment, offering no numbers meant to impress her, and no stories meant to earn her approval. He did not mention the size of his consultancy. He did not mention the towers with his name quietly attached to their permits. When she pushed harder, testing whether he would eventually break into the kind of performance most men gave her, hoping flattery might soften a woman worth billions, he simply waited until she finished and then asked her a question of his own. "What is the thing that exhausts you most before your coffee has even gone cold?" he asked. Celeste went still. It was such a small, strange question. Nothing like the interview questions she fielded from financial journalists, nothing like the pickup lines disguised as business talk she had endured at 100 galas before this one. Nobody had ever asked her that. She opened her mouth to deflect, to answer with something clever and unrevealing the way she always did, and instead heard herself say the truth, that she woke every morning already tired of being suspected, already bracing for the day's first attempt to manipulate her. She talked for nearly 10 of their 20 minutes, longer than she had spoken about herself to anyone in years, and when she finally noticed how much she had said, a flicker of something close to alarm crossed her face. She had not planned to say any of it. She had walked into the gala prepared to endure a scripted flirtation, and instead found herself confessing exhaustion to a stranger with quiet eyes. When the 20 minutes ended, she stood up first, smoothed her dress, and walked away without a word, leaving Damon at the small table, with the distinct sense that something in the evening had shifted far more than either of them intended. By the following morning, a photograph of the two of them leaning close together at that small table had already traveled across every financial gossip account in the city. The story practically wrote itself. The coldest woman on Wall Street caught in intimate conversation with a mysterious former architect nobody in finance circles recognized by sight. Reporters who had profiled Celeste for a decade began calling her office, asking whether the rumors were true, whether Van Doren Capital's famously guarded chief executive had finally let someone in. A financial columnist who had once written that Celeste possessed the emotional warmth of a spreadsheet published a piece within hours titled "A question mark where her heart should be," speculating wildly about the nature of the encounter with barely a fact to support any of it. Photographers began waiting outside the Van Doren Capital building each morning, hoping to catch a second image that might confirm or deny the growing rumor. Celeste's assistant fielded nearly 40 calls before noon, each one asking some version of the same impossible question, whether the Ice Queen had finally melted. Inside the Van Doren Capital building, the whispering started before the elevators had even opened for the morning shift. Junior analysts traded theories in the break room. Senior partners exchanged worried glances in the hallway outside the boardroom. certain that whatever softness had crept into their chief executive overnight represented a liability that needed managing. Two of her longest-serving board members requested an emergency meeting before lunch, insisting that a man with no fortune of his own attaching himself to Celeste so publicly could only be angling for access to her company. The meeting itself lasted nearly 2 hours, filled with speculation dressed up as due diligence, board members asking pointed questions about Damon's finances, his past relationships, his motives, as though Celeste were approving a merger, rather than simply having dinner with a man she had met the night before. One member suggested hiring a private investigator immediately, before anything further developed between them, a suggestion Celeste dismissed with a sharpness that surprised even her, though she would not admit until much later that the sharpness came from somewhere other than irritation at the suggestion itself. One rival financier, a man named Preston Holt, who had lost a hostile bid to Celeste 3 years earlier and never forgiven her for it, began quietly suggesting to reporters that Damon Ashford was likely a fortune hunter dressed up as a philanthropist. The suggestion spread faster than any denial could catch it. Celeste found herself standing in front of her own board defending a man she had known for less than a day. And the strangeness of that fact did not escape her, even as she did it. "He does not need my money," she told them flatly, her voice carrying the same authority she used to end hostile takeover attempts. Nobody in that boardroom appeared to believe her. And for a moment she almost did not believe herself either, uncertain why she felt the need to defend a stranger so fiercely. That afternoon, gossip columns reported that Celeste had personally invited Damon to move into her penthouse on Park Avenue, a story with no basis in fact that nonetheless spread within hours. When Damon heard about the rumor, he called Celeste directly, instead of letting a publicist handle it. "I have not been invited anywhere," he told her plainly. "And even if I had been, I would say no." It was not an insult. His voice carried none of the offense a lesser man might have taken at being accused of chasing a rich woman's address. He simply did not want to live somewhere that would make either of them a headline before they had decided what they actually were to each other. Celeste, listening on the other end of the line, found the refusal oddly more convincing than any declaration of affection could have been. Over the following weeks, Celeste began watching him the way she watched companies before deciding whether to acquire them, quietly, patiently, gathering evidence before drawing conclusions. She arranged, without quite admitting to herself why, to be present at meetings where his consultancy was brought in to advise smaller firms, standing at the edge of the room where she could observe him without being observed herself. She watched him eat lunch at the same folding table as the interns, rather than retreating to a private office, listening to a young analyst nervously explain her theory on a struggling manufacturing client, with the same focused attention he might have given a senior partner twice her seniority. She watched him greet the security guard at the lobby entrance by name every single morning. Ask about the man's daughter's recital. Remember the answer weeks later, and ask again how it had gone. She watched him thank the woman who refilled the coffee station, not with the automatic politeness most executives offered, but with the specific attentiveness of someone who genuinely wanted to know how her week had gone. One afternoon she watched him spend nearly 20 minutes, crouched beside a photocopier with a maintenance worker who could not get the machine to stop jamming, not offering instructions from a distance, but actually helping the man trace the paper feed by hand, laughing quietly at some private joke between them by the time the machine finally cooperated. Nobody around him received different treatment because of their title or their salary. He simply seemed to believe, in some quiet and unshakable way, that every person in a room deserved the same attention regardless of what they could offer him in return. Celeste realized, somewhere in the third week of this quiet surveillance, that she had never once lived that way herself. Her entire career had trained her to sort people instantly into categories of useful and irrelevant, and she had built an empire on the efficiency of that sorting. Watching Damon move through a room without sorting anyone at all felt less like watching a stranger, and more like watching a version of herself that had taken a different road at some point long before either of them had met. That night, for the first time since she had saved his number under his full name rather than a nickname meant to keep him at a distance, Celeste sent Damon a text message with no business purpose attached to it at all. It asked nothing of him, offered no negotiation, contained no hidden agenda. It simply asked whether he had eaten dinner yet. She stared at the screen for nearly a full minute after sending it, startled by how much the small act had cost her, and startled further by how quickly his reply arrived. He suggested a small noodle shop near his apartment in Brooklyn, a place with 4 tables and no reservation list. The kind of restaurant that had never once appeared in any gala conversation Celeste had ever taken part in. She arrived without her usual security detail, wearing a plain coat over jeans, and sat across from him at a table so small their knees nearly touched. The owner, an older man named Hector who clearly knew Damon well, brought their food without being asked what they wanted, and Celeste realized halfway through the meal that nobody in the restaurant had recognized her at all. For 2 hours she talked about things she had never discussed with anyone in her professional life. Her father's insistence that she take over the family business before she had even finished college, the loneliness of boardrooms, where everyone smiled at her and meant none of it, the strange grief of being feared rather than known. Damon listened without offering advice she had not asked for, without trying to fix anything, simply present in a way that made the silence between her sentences feel safe rather than awkward. When she finally looked at the clock and realized how late it had gotten, she felt something she had not felt walking out of a meeting in years, a reluctance to leave. The crisis at Van Doren Capital arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning. When a $9 billion acquisition the firm had spent 18 months assembling began collapsing in real time, the target company's board withdrew its support overnight, citing concerns about cultural fit that nobody in Celeste's leadership team could quite explain. Panic moved through the executive floor within the hour. Several senior partners proposed immediate layoffs across 3 divisions as a way to reassure jittery shareholders that the firm remained disciplined even in crisis. Celeste found herself caught between the demands of a board that wanted blood and her own instinct that the numbers alone did not explain what was happening. Her chief financial officer, a sharp but anxious man named Arthur Pruitt, kept insisting the collapse was a simple case of a nervous seller getting cold feet, urging her to move forward with the layoffs before the market had time to react further. Something about his explanation felt too convenient, too eager to close a wound rather than understand it, and Celeste found herself unable to trust the easy answer for the first time in her career. She called Damon, not as a romantic gesture, but because she genuinely did not know who else to trust with the truth of what she was seeing. He arrived at her office within the hour, asked to see the actual internal communications rather than the polished summary her team had prepared, and spent nearly 2 hours in silence reading through them line by line while Celeste paced near the window, watching the city lights flicker on below as the afternoon dimmed into evening. At one point, Arthur knocked on the door, visibly irritated to find an outsider poring over sensitive documents, and demanded to know what qualified a former architect to weigh in on a $9 billion transaction. Celeste, without raising her voice, told him that Damon had already found something in 2 hours that the entire finance team had missed in 18 months, and asked him to wait outside until they were finished. Arthur left without another word, and something in the way Celeste had defended a stranger's judgment over her own longtime employee did not go unnoticed by anyone on the floor that evening. The problem was never the financials, he finally told her. The target company's employees had grown afraid of being absorbed into an organization known for treating people as disposable line items, and that fear, not any flaw in the deal itself, was what had turned their board against the merger. Nobody had bothered to address the human cost of the acquisition because nobody at Van Doren Capital had been trained to think that cost mattered. Celeste sat with that assessment for a long moment, recognizing in it an uncomfortable mirror of everything she had built her reputation on. Together they drafted a revised proposal that guaranteed job protections, preserved the target company's internal leadership structure, and included a personal letter from Celeste explaining, for the first time in her public career, why the deal mattered to her beyond the balance sheet. The target company's board reversed its decision within 4 days. When Celeste's team offered to pay Damon a consulting fee that would have been the largest single payment his firm had ever received, he declined it without hesitation, saying only that he had not helped her to be paid for it. The refusal unsettled her more than any negotiation tactic ever had. She was accustomed to a world where every kindness carried a price tag attached somewhere beneath the surface. And Damon's insistence on offering his help without cost left her searching for the catch that never arrived. Unable to let the mystery rest, Celeste quietly commissioned a background review of the man who had just saved her company, expecting to finally uncover the angle everyone around her insisted must exist. What she found instead reshaped everything she thought she understood about him. Nearly a decade earlier, Damon had sold his architecture firm for just over $2 billion at the peak of his fame. A sum that could have bought him any penthouse in the city and any life of leisure he wanted. Instead, records showed he had quietly funneled almost the entire amount into a private foundation that rescued small businesses from bankruptcy, family restaurants, neighborhood hardware stores, independent bookshops crushed by rising rents, saving hundreds of them without ever attaching his name publicly to a single rescue. He lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, drove a car that was nearly a decade old, and had never once given an interview about the foundation, which operated under a name that concealed his involvement entirely. He was not simple because he lacked options. He had chosen a simple life deliberately, after having every luxury available to him, and deciding none of it interested him as much as watching a struggling shop owner keep the lights on. The report included a list of businesses the foundation had quietly rescued over the years. A family-owned diner in Queens facing eviction after its landlord tripled the rent, a small print shop in the Bronx that had employed the same 6 people for over 2 decades, an independent bookstore in Brooklyn that had been days from closing its doors before an anonymous grant appeared in its account. None of the owners interviewed by the investigator Celeste had hired knew the true source of the money that saved them. Several described it only as a foundation that asked for nothing in return, not equity, not naming rights, not even a thank you letter mailed to a real address. One diner owner, a woman in her 60s named Dolores, told the investigator through tears that she had prayed for a miracle the week before the grant arrived and had spent every day since wondering who on earth would do something so generous and never once come forward to be thanked for it. Celeste read the final page of the report twice, then set it down and sat in silence for a long time. He never told anyone, she said quietly to herself, and the realization landed with more weight than any acquisition she had ever closed. In a world where every person she had ever known used generosity as currency, expecting eventual repayment in influence or gratitude or leverage, Damon had given away a fortune and asked for nothing in return, not even recognition. Something in Celeste's carefully guarded chest cracked open that evening in a way she did not yet have language for. The change in her began slowly enough that most people at Van Doren Capital assumed it was a passing mood rather than a genuine shift. She started smiling in meetings where she once would have delivered only clipped instructions. She began asking junior analysts for their opinions before announcing decisions, a habit so foreign to the culture of the firm that several employees initially assumed they were being tested rather than genuinely consulted. She quietly rescinded a dress code policy that had fined employees for minor infractions, a rule that had never once applied to her own wardrobe. For the first time in longer than anyone on her staff could remember, Celeste rode the elevator down to the ground floor cafeteria and ate lunch among her own employees, rather than having a meal delivered to her office. Conversations at nearby tables faltered into stunned silence when she sat down, then slowly resumed as people realized she was not there to evaluate anyone, only to eat a sandwich like everyone else in the room. Damon had never once instructed her to behave this way. He had simply lived his own life as an example, and she had absorbed the lesson the way water eventually reshapes stone. One afternoon, a woman named Ruth, who had worked in the firm's compliance department for nearly 17 years, found herself unexpectedly summoned to Celeste's office, certain she was about to be reprimanded for some overlooked detail. Instead, Celeste asked her, plainly and without an agenda, how her recovery from a recent surgery was progressing, information she had only learned by finally reading the internal memos her assistant sent her every week, rather than deleting them unread. Ruth left the office in tears, later telling colleagues it was the first time in her entire career that a chief executive had asked about her as a person rather than as a productivity statistic. Word of the encounter spread quietly through the building over the following days, not as gossip but as something closer to quiet disbelief. Employees comparing notes on small kindnesses they had begun noticing from a woman who had built her entire reputation on not noticing anyone at all. A mailroom clerk mentioned that Celeste had learned his name after 11 years of working in the same building. A junior associate mentioned that she had personally approved an extended leave request that would once have been denied automatically by an assistant without ever reaching her desk. None of it happened overnight, and none of it happened without setbacks. Celeste still lost her patience in meetings, still delivered blunt assessments that stung people unprepared for her honesty, still carried the sharp instincts that had built her empire in the first place. But something underneath the sharpness had softened, a willingness to see the people around her as more than instruments of quarterly performance, and that willingness rippled outward through the company in ways no policy memo could have accomplished on its own. The plot to separate them arrived exactly as Celeste had feared it eventually would. Preston Holt, still nursing the wound of his failed hostile takeover years earlier, began circulating a story to financial reporters, claiming Damon had orchestrated the entire relationship as a calculated maneuver to gain influence over Van Doren Capital's board, positioning himself to eventually seize control of the company from within. The story spread across financial news outlets within a single afternoon, gaining momentum with every retelling, each version more damning than the last. Shareholders who had grown accustomed to Celeste's ruthless reputation as the firm's greatest asset began demanding an explanation for her sudden softness, some openly speculating that Damon had somehow compromised her judgment. Board members, who had never trusted the relationship, used the manufactured scandal as justification to formally request that Celeste end all contact with him, framing it as a matter of fiduciary responsibility rather than personal interference. The pressure mounted with a speed that left even Celeste, a woman who had weathered a dozen genuine crises, struggling to keep her footing. Damon watched the story unfold from a distance, aware that every day he remained visibly connected to Celeste, added fuel to a fire that threatened everything she had built. He spent 2 sleepless nights turning the situation over in his mind, weighing what he wanted against what protecting her actually required, and each time he arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. He had spent years building a quiet, unremarkable life, specifically so that nothing he did could ever be used as a weapon against someone else, and now his mere presence beside Celeste had become exactly that weapon in Preston Holt's hands. He made his decision without consulting her, arriving at her office late one evening, not to fight for their relationship, but to end it before it cost her more than she could afford to lose. The lights in the executive floor were mostly off by the time he arrived, and Celeste's assistant had already gone home, leaving the two of them alone in a corridor, lit only by the glow of the city outside the windows. "I do not want you to lose everything because of me," he told her quietly, his voice steady, even as something behind his eyes betrayed how much the decision cost him. Celeste tried to argue, reminding him that she had survived every attack thrown at her for 19 years and had no intention of letting Preston Holt dictate who she was allowed to care about. Damon shook his head gently, telling her that this was different, that a board vote of no confidence could strip her of the company she had spent her entire adult life building, and that he refused to be the reason she lost it. He turned toward the elevator before she could find the right words to stop him, and for a moment it seemed the conversation, and perhaps everything between them, had simply ended. Celeste stood frozen for a long moment after he turned to leave, watching the door close behind a man who had asked nothing of her the entire time she had known him, and who was now walking away for the exact same reason. Something in her that had remained locked for 19 years finally broke loose. She grabbed her coat, ran through the lobby past a startled security guard, who had never once seen her move faster than a measured walk, and caught up to him on the sidewalk outside, the first time in her adult life she had ever chased after anyone. The autumn air was sharp and cold, and a light rain had begun falling over Park Avenue. But neither of them seemed to notice it. She caught his sleeve before he could open the door of a waiting car. And when he turned to face her, she found herself, for the first time since she was a very young woman, without a prepared argument or a strategy for what to say next. "You do not get to decide alone what I am willing to lose," she told him, her voice cracking in a way that would have been unthinkable to the boardroom she had left minutes earlier. Damon studied her for a long moment in the rain, searching her face for the calculation he had once assumed must exist somewhere beneath her composure, and found only the same honesty she had shown him at that small table by the terrace doors months earlier. He did not walk away again. Instead, he asked her, quietly, whether she understood what she might be risking by choosing to fight this battle in public rather than letting him disappear quietly. She told him she had already decided, and that she would rather lose the company than spend the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she had let him go. The emergency shareholder meeting convened 3 days later in a conference hall packed with reporters, board members, and investors eager to witness the unraveling of the Ice Queen's carefully built empire. Preston Holt stood before the assembled crowd and presented what he called irrefutable evidence, a set of documents purporting to show private communications between Damon and an outside investment group allegedly plotting to seize control of Van Doren Capital through Celeste's influence. Damon rose from his seat calmly, walked to the front of the room, and requested permission to address the accusation directly. He produced his own set of records, financial statements, email timestamps, and sworn testimony from the very investment group Preston claimed he was conspiring with, proving beyond dispute that the documents had been fabricated and the story manufactured entirely by Preston himself in an attempt to regain the market position he had lost years earlier. The room fell into stunned silence as the fabrication was laid bare piece by piece. He went further still, revealing evidence that Preston's own firm was on the verge of a lawsuit that could have cost Van Doren Capital's shareholders hundreds of millions of dollars had it gone undetected, a scheme Damon had uncovered entirely on his own time, without ever mentioning it to Celeste beforehand, working through public filings and court records late into the night for nearly a week, rather than simply defending himself with denials. The very man who had spent weeks trying to destroy their relationship had, in trying to do so, accidentally exposed a threat to the company that could have caused catastrophic damage had it gone unnoticed. Preston rose from his seat, his face reddening, attempting to dismiss the documents as fabrications of Damon's own making, but the sworn testimony from the investment group he had claimed to be conspiring with left him with nothing credible to say. 2 of his own board members, seated in the audience as invited guests, quietly gathered their belongings and left before the meeting had even concluded, unwilling to be seen associating with a man who had just been exposed in front of the entire financial press. Board members who had demanded Celeste's public denunciation of Damon now sat staring at him in open astonishment, several of them exchanging glances that suggested they were already rehearsing apologies for the following morning. Celeste rose from her seat at the head table without waiting for the meeting's formal conclusion, crossed the room in front of every reporter and shareholder present, and took Damon's hand in hers. "I trust him," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. The first time in her entire public career she had spoken those 3 words about anyone. The photograph of that moment, her hand wrapped around his in front of 500 witnesses, would appear on the front page of every financial publication in the city by morning, but neither of them was thinking about headlines when it happened. A year passed, and the transformation inside Van Doren Capital had become impossible for even its harshest critics to ignore. Employee turnover, once among the highest in the industry, had dropped to nearly nothing. Internal surveys ranked the firm among the most desirable places to work in the entire financial sector, a reputation nobody would have predicted for a company once feared for its brutal culture. Revenue had grown steadily, not despite the changes Celeste had made, but because of them, as clients increasingly sought out a firm known for treating both its people and its partners with genuine respect. Dolores, the diner owner in Queens, whose rent had once nearly ended her livelihood, now supplied pastries every Friday morning to the entire executive floor at Van Doren Capital, a small tradition Celeste had started after finally meeting the woman in person and hearing her story firsthand. Ruth, the compliance officer who had once left Celeste's office in tears of surprise, had since been promoted twice and now mentored 3 younger employees using the same patient attentiveness Celeste had first learned to value by watching Damon. Arthur Pruitt, the anxious chief financial officer who had once dismissed Damon's involvement in the failed acquisition, had become one of his most vocal supporters within the firm, crediting the near collapse of that $9 billion deal as the moment he learned to look past numbers toward the people those numbers actually represented. Preston Holt's firm folded within 8 months of the exposed scandal, his reputation too damaged to recover, and few in the industry mourned its passing. At industry galas across the city, people still told the story of that autumn evening at the Ashcombe Tower, the joke pairing that had somehow become the most talked about romance on Wall Street. Waiters who had once quietly taken bets on how quickly the pairing would end now told newer staff the story as something closer to legend. What had begun as a punchline delivered for the amusement of 500 wealthy strangers had transformed, improbably, into a story people told each other with something close to reverence. Proof that even the most hardened reputations could soften under the right kind of patience. At an annual gala honoring the city's most inspiring business leaders, the same master of ceremonies who had drawn their names from a glass bowl a year earlier stood before the crowd once more, this time introducing Damon and Celeste as the evening's guests of honor. She asked him, with a knowing smile, whether he would change anything if he could relive that first night. Damon looked at Celeste, standing beside him in a room full of people who had once laughed at the idea of the two of them together, and answered simply that he only wished someone had paired them sooner. The room rose to its feet in applause that lasted longer than anyone could remember. Applause lasting at any gala before it. Celeste did not change because she fell in love overnight, and anyone searching the story for a single dramatic turning point would be searching for something that never existed. She changed slowly, deliberately, because for the first time in her adult life she had met someone who looked at her and saw a person rather than a fortune to be managed or a reputation to be feared. Damon never tried to conquer her with wealth he had already given away or power he had never wanted to keep. He won her, if that word even applies to what grew between them, through steadiness, through honesty, and through the quiet, patient gift of making another human being feel truly seen. What began as a cruel joke played for the entertainment of New York's wealthiest circle became, in the end, the story most often repeated on Wall Street, not as gossip but as something closer to a parable, a reminder that growth, trust, and second chances can arrive from the most unlikely pairing imaginable, and that sometimes the people everyone underestimates are the ones capable of changing everything. Long after the reporters stopped calling and the gossip columns moved on to newer scandals, the small noodle shop in Brooklyn remained their quiet ritual, a corner table where a billionaire and a man who had given his fortune away still met most Sundays, unrecognized and unbothered, exactly as they had the very first time. Hector still brought their food without asking, and Celeste still lingered longer than she meant to, no longer surprised by how much she wanted to stay. What the whole city eventually understood, long after the laughter in that ballroom had faded into something else entirely, was that the joke had never really been on either of them. It had been on everyone who assumed a person's worth could be measured before they were truly known.